It feels almost redundant to make a video about the Fallout games. With it being such a hugely popular franchise, there have been plenty of videos ranking the games and discussing the lore. This is not going to be a lore breakdown or a challenge video or even an in-depth look into every single side quest, companion, and story beat of the series. As someone who's been obsessed with these games for almost 15 years, I love all of them, except one. I haven't really given Fallout 76 a fair shake due to, well, you know. But I've heard that the game is actually worth playing nowadays, at least from some people. So I'm excited to give that game a shot and see if it's really all that bad. Before we get started, I want to clarify that I'm not going to be looking at spin-offs like Fallout Tactics and Brotherhood of Steel. I'm just not really interested in Fallout games that don't feel and play like Fallout games. I'm also not going to be including DLCs, as I kind of want to make another big video covering all of those if this one does well enough. I have a ranking in my head currently going into this, so I'm interested to see if playing the games back to back like this is going to change my perception of any of these entries. But who knows, I'm pretty stuck in my ways. I'll be providing a quick ranking at the end of the video to conclude my thoughts on each entry and see how they stack up against each other, but I will be trying my best to give each title a fair shake. And though I will be comparing them back and forth a lot, I love pretty much every game in the series, so if you don't agree with some of my comparisons here, just know that this is my opinion and isn't fact. With that being said, let's get into it. Released in 1997 by Interplay for the PC, Fallout is one of the best CRPG experiences you can have. There's something so tight and concise about this first game, and it's one of my favorites to come back to. You know it's gonna be a sick experience just from that iconic opening cutscene. They even put an option in the menu to rewatch it because they knew it was so cool. This is a point I'll elaborate on later, but I would have loved a 3D Fallout game to actually look like this. And the opening cutscene is a glimpse into what that might have been like. The game has a couple pre-made characters, but we all know that creating your own is the way to go. This character creation is a stroke of genius. Some people may disagree with this sentiment, but to me, it's perfect for an RPG, because even if it seems confusing at first, it can be totally broken if you know what you're doing. It also lends itself to different playstyles perfectly. You want to play a melee-focused, barbarian-esque character? Go ahead. You want to talk your way through many situations instead of fighting, or increase your gambling skill for basically unlimited money? The game accommodates this and many other playstyles easily. Approach Fallout the way you feel like approaching it. Or you could just select the gifted trait and put the game on easy, then flip it back for a permanent points boost to even out the drop in skill points you have. If I'm gonna be honest, I do think cheesing these old games is kind of fun. Especially since the game is definitely going to cheese you pretty hard at certain points. So, Fallout 1 doesn't give a single f***. Unlike the Bethesda Fallout games, which all have long, cinematic, borderline tutorials in the vaults or in pre-war segments, Fallout 1 just throws you into a cave with rats. All you know is that your vault needs a water chip, and the game leaves you up to your devices on how to get it. All you have is a lead on a vault nearby that potentially doesn't even have one. Spoiler alert, it doesn't. Unfortunately, one of the few flaws of the first Fallout is that it's messed with its own approach here. The game is perfectly fine to give you as much freedom as possible, but there is a time limit imposed during the first half, which somewhat works against the game's own merits. Thankfully, the time limit is pretty lenient. Just be careful how much you use the wait mechanic. It's here in the caves that the game gives you your first combat interaction. So I'm not going to rehash what many have said and say that combat is bad or is aged poorly. Personally, it's not something that bothers me, and it adds to Fallout's excellent sense of progression. As you level up and get more perks and increase your stats, the combat becomes easier, and it's always satisfying to build your character around certain combat specialties. I always build mine around getting crits as much as possible, and it makes the combat a lot more forgiving later on. Anyway, once you leave the caves, you'll likely start heading towards the only location that's marked on your map, Vault 15. But the game not so subtly puts a small town directly in your path. The way this game seems to inch you closer to your goals without having a list of objectives or a waypoint marker is effortless and fluid. A great example of this is Junktown, one of the earlier towns in the game. You come to Junktown as just a stopgap in your journey, but suddenly get wrapped up in two guys controlling the town who want each other dead. You could easily spend an hour or so in this side quest alone, and the game is so effortless in throwing you off the beaten path for a fun and engaging story that you'll forget how you even got there to begin with. This is also an example of Fallout's moral ambiguity. There's not a fully correct and satisfying answer to this quest. You can do the perceived morally correct thing in helping Killian and killing Gizmo, but the town's business suffers for it, giving the quest another layer. There's lots of examples like this. Yeah, there's some side quests like this one that's basically just, hey, my house has bad guys, you kill the bad guys and the day is saved. But most of the bigger side quests that are specific to certain locations have this layer of ambiguity that makes picking a side incredibly interesting. This is something that carries into the best games of the series, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Fallout's world, though actually pretty small, feels huge and alive. There's only a few locations, but random encounters on the map, the numerous NPCs you meet on your quest, and the fact that the player character feels like such a small part of the story early on add to the game's perceived size. As someone who played the later games first, like I imagine 99% of the people watching this have, it's really impressive to go back and see just how much of what makes those later games great is already established in this first title. Fallout has a reputation for being archaic or dated, but I prefer to call it advanced or charming. Yeah, I mean, graphically it doesn't look amazing or anything, but in terms of art style and atmosphere, the game holds up incredibly well. And the lesser level of detail never detracted from my experience. Except whenever I can't tell who's on screen because a lot of the NPCs look exactly the same. But Fallout lives up to the hype. It's an RPG that feels truly free. Like all of the best games in the series, it does a fantastic job setting up the main story to appear relatively simple at first, before unraveling into a life or death situation. Not just for you, but for the wasteland as a whole. Sound familiar? In 1, it's the water chip, then the super mutants and the master. In 2, it's the village of Arroyo and the Gek, then it's the Enclave. In New Vegas, it's the courier getting shot, the platinum chip, then Hoover Dam. I could keep going on, but it's impressive how much of a blueprint Fallout 1 really is. Concise seems to be the perfect descriptor for this game. It's not very long, and sometimes it feels a bit lacking in content compared to its sequels, but bigger doesn't always equate to better, and Fallout 1's quest design and atmosphere is up there with the best in the series. In fact, this might be my single favorite game in the series atmospherically. The art style is just so dark and decrepit. It makes sense that this game takes place closest to when the bombs dropped out of any game in the series. It's pretty bleak. Yeah, people have started to build societies from the rubble, and it's not entirely hopeless, but it has an overwhelming feeling of dread to it, without being so overly comical like many of the series' later entries. Don't get me wrong, the game definitely has a sense of humor, but it doesn't feel so beaten into the ground yet. One of the biggest things contributing to the bleak atmosphere of the game is the excellent score by Mark Morgan. It's borderline soul-suckingly eerie, and it fits perfectly with the game's art style. I mentioned briefly wanting to see a 3D Fallout game that looks like these first 2 games in the series, and though I think the Fallout series actually made a pretty graceful transition to 3D, I'd still love to see one in this style. That brooding red sky, the late 90s PC graphics, the uncanny talking heads. It all adds to the game's charm and makes it just feel so unique. You really feel like part of the world, both because the game is so immersive in its design, but also in its RPG mechanics. Fallout 1 also has an incredibly memorable and intriguing final boss. Obviously, the Master's character design is fantastic and something that's hard to forget, but what's also great about him is his reasoning as a villain. It's easy to see why he does the things he does, and it's hard to fault a man striving for unity in the dark and unforgiving wastes, even if doing so unethically. He also listens to reason. If you find out that the mutants are sterile somewhere along your adventure, you can bring this up to him and he will destroy the cathedral and give up on his dreams upon hearing the news. Overall, it's a great conclusion and one that represents Fallout's strengths. And just like every encounter, you get to decide what to do here. You can talk him out of his plans, you can engage in combat directly, you can even find a nuke under the cathedral and take the whole place out without even talking to or meeting the Master at all. I like the Bethesda Fallout games, but this is before the series resorted to unkillable NPCs, enemy scaling, and a straight-line waypoint marker main quest. There's a lot to love about Fallout 1, but unfortunately it's not perfect. Most people seem to blame Bethesda for the bugginess of Fallout games. But even the early Interplay titles shipped pretty buggy. There are patches, and they're included with the GOG and Steam releases, so I highly recommend going for those if you can. I believe the versions available on Xbox Game Pass for PC are patched too, but I'm not certain. Definitely don't play without it. Unfortunately, even with the patches included, you can still run into some problems and jank. It's a 27-year-old game, and it can feel like it at times. There's also just some things that aren't perfect for the role-playing. Like for example, at the Boneyard, I went straight for the death claws without talking to any NPCs, and killed all of them for the gunrunners. And when I came back to do some side quests, my character still acted as if I'd never even seen them. Same deal when I went to talk to the Brotherhood. The Elder mentions not even believing the death claws truly exist, and there's no dialogue option for saying that they actually do and you fought them. This stuff is pretty minor, but it's something that later Fallout games do a lot better, that makes you feel like you've got a lot more impact on the world. Like in New Vegas, when you clear the Deathclaws in Quarry Junction. You can go to Sloan and tell Chomps Lewis that they're all dead, even if you haven't met him before. But in terms of a concise and tight RPG that does what it sets out to do well, you'd have a hard time doing better than the original Fallout. Especially when considering the small but dedicated team that made the project. The work that was done here is wildly impressive. The game gives you that incredibly open-ended game design to tackle problems however you see fit, and that's exactly what Fallout is all about. It introduced the special system, skill point system, traits, and perks all in this first game, and it's still one of the best ways to design a character in an RPG, and it's something I'm really disappointed that they ended up changing. But we'll get there when we get there. For now, let's take a quick look at Fallout's much bigger and more ambitious sequel, Fallout 2. So Fallout 1 was developed largely by Tim Kaine, who honestly probably deserves credit for the entire series, considering it kind of started as his passion project. Fallout 1 was a pretty big deal in terms of super nerdy PC RPGs and managed to sell pretty well. So a sequel was definitely in the cards. Tim Kaine and his team started work on Fallout 2 before 1 even released, and continued developing for a while, until he quit Interplay due to conflicting ideals about the direction of the Fallout series and mismanagement. This is a gross oversimplification, so I recommend checking out his YouTube channel. He has a lot of videos where he talks about developing Fallout, working at Interplay, and RPG game design, and it's really interesting and insightful for fans of the series. But long story short, after losing his bonus and not being able to see eye to eye with Brian Fargo, CEO of Interplay, Tim Kaine, as well as 2 other people who worked on OG Fallout, left Interplay to start their own company, Troika Games. Troika would go on to make some great games, including one of my favorites, Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines. And Interplay would continue work on Fallout 2, although technically the game was developed by an in-house group at Interplay called Black Isle Studios. Fallout 2 was bigger and in some ways better than its predecessor. There's probably double the locations, characters, side quests, and just content in general compared to Fallout 1. Fallout 1 gives you a water chip to go after, and then suddenly you find yourself in a much higher stakes situation. In this game, the Gek is the MacGuffin and the Enclave is the much bigger late game threat. I wish I could say the beginning of this game was handled with grace, but unfortunately compared to any other non-Bethesda Fallout game, this game has by far the worst opening. It's interesting hearing Tim Kaine talk about why this happened. I once again highly recommend his channel. Apparently the tutorial intro was mandated by the marketing team, despite objections from most of the devs and designers. Anyway, yeah, the Temple of Trials is unskippable and quite tedious. It's not so bad your first time through, and you can at least talk your way out of fighting at the end of it, which helps teach the player that there will be many ways to approach each obstacle in the game. Compare this to the vaults in Bethesda games, where you pretty much have to do exactly what the game wants you to do. To cut Bethesda some slack, a lot of people seem to think that they were the first ones to rehash premises from previous games, or to implement boring intros. But no, that started in the Interplay era with Fallout 2. To give Fallout 2 credit, acquiring the Gek isn't nearly the same as getting a water chip, but go get this MacGuffin seems to be a good enough reason to get you out into the wastes. And once you're given total freedom, Fallout 2 is mostly fantastic. It's pretty similar to the first in terms of quest design, which is a good thing. There's just a lot more here. Unlike Fallout 1, there's no time limit for the first bit of the main quest. The game kind of pretends that there is with these telepathic visions you get of the village dying throughout the game, which definitely adds some urgency. However, no matter how fast or slow you go with getting the Gek, the village suffers the same fate. Technically, the game will just suddenly end after 13 in-game years, but the chances of you actually hitting that are incredibly slim. Because of this and the bigger map, it's easier to get lost in Fallout 2 and spend more time with it. The Enclave is a series staple and a hugely intimidating big bad for the game as well. I think the super mutants and the Master from the first game are written a little bit better though. You can actually understand the Master's ethos, and it doesn't just feel evil for the sake of it. It's hard to say the same about the Enclave. There's not a lot of justification for them doing the things they do. I'm not saying they lack depth entirely, but the Enclave definitely doesn't stack up to the excellent writing of the Master in Fallout 1. That is some of the best writing and character design in the series. What the Enclave does represent to me though, is an excellent towering foe that makes me want to become high level and take out Frank Horrigan every time. That's something really satisfying about Fallout 2 and just the series in general. The RPG mechanics are fine-tuned to make you feel like such a beast in the endgame, and it's really rewarding, especially when you've spent 15 to 20 hours to get there. I'll talk more about the final boss here in a bit, but one thing I want to touch on is the difference in atmosphere between this game and its predecessor. Fallout 2 feels a bit more lively in atmosphere than Fallout 1, but definitely not in tone. There's themes of I think it's a bit much. Not because I don't think the series can handle these topics with grace and respect, but because I don't think it's handled that way here. The game is kind of covered in this childish sense of humor and view of sex that's sometimes admittedly funny, but really takes you out of the experience other times. Don't get me wrong, the series has always had a great sense of humor, and there's a few lines here that really crack me up, but the game is just taking the haha sexual joke thing really far in a way that hurts the experience overall, I think. Like when you get in an arm wrestling competition with a super mutant and your punishment is to be the mutant's gimp for the night, it's just silly and adds nothing to the game. That being said, when the writing is good, it's really good. There's a lot of great talking heads here, but I don't think there's as many charismatic ones as the first. There's definitely memorable assholes. Those are everywhere. And overall, the character writing's pretty good. There's a lot of quirky moments here where I can tell the developers were having fun with us, and I think that's cool. Like when you get to Vault 8 in Vault City and find out that the water chips from the first game were accidentally sent here instead of Vault 13. And of course, the fact that the Gek is found in Vault 13, making it a nice callback to the first game. You can go on and on about the differences between the two games, but truthfully, it had been a few years since I played either, and some things between them kind of blended in my mind. That's because Fallout 2 is a true sequel. It's not really trying anything that different, it's not reinventing the wheel or anything, it's just the same Fallout formula from the first game, with a lot more content and new story. When you look at it that way, Fallout 2 is an unequivocal success. This is Fallout, and more of it. It's slightly more action focused, there's a lot more weaponry to choose from, there's a lot more NPCs to meet and towns to go to. On paper, it's better in just about every way than Fallout 1, but unfortunately, it falls a little flat compared to the first for me. I think Fallout 2 is the overall bigger and better experience. The side quests are really good and fleshed out for the most part, and you can lose yourself for hours in Fallout 2's Wasteland. But I do think that Fallout 1 is an overall more enjoyable time. It's quality over quantity for me. Small criticism here, but I will say, the first two Fallouts are a lot more linear than people give them credit for. Yeah, you're free to do most things as you please, but did you know if you aggro Arroyo at the beginning of the game, then leave, the game will just end? You literally have to save your village in Fallout 2, and you have to get the water chip in Fallout 1, or you will also get a game over. To be fair, I think there's only one game in the series that isn't like this, and I'm sure you know which one it is. Yeah, there should ultimately be an end goal so that the game can end eventually, but I do think it's slightly frustrating to be railroaded in certain parts of what's ultimately an incredibly free and open experience. Nitpicks aside, Fallout 2 is great and offers a decent final boss. It's just a gigantic super mutant in custom huge power armor. Yeah, it's really nothing crazy, but he is incredibly imposing. Perhaps not as much of a horrifying Cronenberg monstrosity as the Master in the first game, and definitely less interesting than him too, but it suffices. One thing that does bother me a good bit is the fact that you can't talk him down. Many other Fallout games usually have speech checks to talk down the final bosses in the games, kind of cementing speech as a cornerstone of the series and rightfully making it just as useful as combat. But there's no option to do that here. I kind of get it. This is literally a 10-foot tall super mutant crazy soldier guy. He's ready for a fight. but still, it's a bit disappointing that it's not here. I do love how he keeps calling you a mutie, despite being over 10 feet tall and a literal super mutant. Shortly before the fight, we do get to hear the Enclave's master plan, and it's incredibly evil as you would suspect. The goal is to use FEV as a bioweapon to basically wipe out humanity except for the Enclave. Yeah, it doesn't make a lot of sense. Kinda just seems like they're evil just to be evil. Don't get me wrong, it definitely works, and the Enclave as a whole are a really intimidating faction. It just doesn't really seem in line with the series' usually in-depth and lore-heavy writing style. One thing that's pretty neat about Fallout 2 is the ability to keep playing once you've beaten the game. This pretty much means that you can get the main quest out of the way and then do all of the side quests at your own leisure as a heavy power-armored beast. This is really fun and something the series should have learned from and did in every subsequent entry. Overall, I ragged on it pretty hard, but Fallout 2 is an amazing game and one I was happy to come back to for this video. It's definitely got some flaws, and I'm not just talking about the same stuff you hear relentlessly online about how unplayable and cryptic the old games are. I'm talking about the humor, the choices, the main storyline even. It's a fantastic game, but it just doesn't fully meet the mark in the way that other games in the series do for me. I'm honestly shocked to have come to this conclusion because I remember loving this game when I first played it and feeling that it could be my favorite in the series. But spending time with it again has made me realize that it's definitely not. That being said, in terms of a fantastic Fallout experience, you could do a whole lot worse than Fallout 2. So what was next for the Fallout series? There were a couple spin-offs. I've heard middling things about them, but admittedly never played them. And honestly, I've got a lot of games to play, so I'm not going to look at them for this video. But they exist, and they were pretty much the only thing Fallout related to come out for almost 10 years. So what happened? Well, Interplay was not making a lot of money. There were at least 2 attempts to get Fallout 3 off the ground, with one of them even having a leaked tech demo. Fallout 3 Van Buren, as it's called by fans, probably would have been a huge game, and honestly, seems like it would have been fantastic. Many subtle story beats from New Vegas were taken from the cancelled Van Buren, most notably characters like Joshua Graham and factions like Caesar's Legion. It's an interesting what if, but unfortunately, or fortunately depending on how you look at it, Interplay ran out of money and sold the Fallout IP to Bethesda in 2004. A lot of people wanted it too, apparently even Troika Games, that company I mentioned earlier founded by OG Fallout devs, was interested in buying the IP. But Bethesda had Morrowind money now and made a smart financial move in the acquisition of the series. They also made sure that Fallout 3 would happen, and happen it did. Finally released in 2008, we got a proper new entry in the Fallout series. This game would prove to be incredibly different from the series' previous entries, maintaining some RPG mechanics, but completely switching genres from a turn-based RPG to a first-person shooter RPG hybrid. This move undoubtedly brought a lot of new fans to the series, myself included. It's a lot easier for a modern gamer to wrap their heads around this than this. However, as I touched on before, if you just click to the Fallout 3 section of the video and haven't played the older games, I highly recommend you do so. They're not that archaic or unforgiving, and you're genuinely missing out on a great experience. Okay, now that I've gotten that out of the way, Fallout 3 is a decent game. Much like 2, I have quite a few grievances with it, except probably even more so for this one. But let's touch on some positives. Mechanically, they did about as good a job as they possibly could given the engine they used. Honestly, it's great. I think besides the plentiful bugs, which aren't really a problem with mods on PC, the way they handled character creation, inventory, graphics, and presentation overall is fantastic for the era that it came out in. There's a lot of things introduced here, or at least expanded on greatly. VATS was introduced in this game, and it's probably one of the most iconic gameplay mechanics in modern FPS history. It's a continuation of the aimed shots in the first 2 titles, but with Fallout 3 being a first-person shooter, it works especially well for this game. The Pip-Boy is also expanded upon a lot. It's a perfect inventory system for the series, and was absolutely nailed down in this game. They also added a radio to the Pip-Boy, and regardless of what you may think about listening to jaunty, old-timey tunes while in combat or engaging in dialogue, it's a cool feature and one I'm glad to have. The The first two games introduced the use of licensed old music in their cinematics. However, it was Fallout 3 that really brought it to the forefront of Fallout's retro-futuristic aesthetic. I also appreciate how they haven't gone too far into the whole 50s America aesthetic. It's always been a part of the series and was handled really well in the first 4 mainline titles, before Fallout 4 went way too far in that direction for my liking. This is also a pretty huge game with a lot to do. It still feels like a Fallout game in that regard. It has a bleak atmosphere, more reminiscent of the first game, and this game's sense of humor didn't really get under my skin the same way that 2's did. The atmosphere in general is something that a lot of people love about Fallout 3, myself included. In fact, a lot of this architecture looks like something right out of the first game. It feels faithful to the series. I'd argue that when it comes to presentation overall, Fallout 3 is damn good, one of the better games in the series. That being said, there's a pretty ugly green filter over the entire game, and even though you could argue it adds to the game's art direction, I usually turn it off with a mod called Fellout. This is the only time I'm going to be using a mod that changes any of these games visually, but it's not like Fallout 3 looks bad without it. It's just something I use pretty much every playthrough, and I didn't want to uninstall it or not use it just for the sake of criticism. That being said, about halfway through I did actually turn it off. Fallout 3 looks good with or without Fellout, and the transition to 3D was handled with grace here, making Fallout 3 one of the best Fallout games ever in regards to atmosphere. Unfortunately, the presentation is about the only aspect of the game that I can truly say that about. There's an admittedly pretty cool opening cinematic to start things off. It's very reminiscent of the cinematic from the first game, which isn't surprising. They used the previous games for inspiration a lot when it came to designing Fallout 3, which is a good thing. However, when it comes to the main story and the factions within the main story, it begins to feel a little like rehashing. You start the game in a vault, similar to the first, except this time you don't start right outside the vault doors. There's a pretty annoying intro to this game going through your first 19 years at the vault. And it's not insanely overly long or anything, but it is quite boring. It's been so long since I played this game for the first time that I don't quite remember, but I imagine it was pretty effective on me the first time. It eases you into it, and I think that's fine. There are a lot of RPGs that are some of my favorites of all time that have long intros or take a while to get fully started. The problem is that they already made this mistake in Fallout 2, and Bethesda didn't learn from Black Isle's blunder here. Another problem with the opening sequence here is that there are only a few genuine role-playing moments. In fact, I can only really think of one. Your high school bully, Butch, initiates dialogue about his mother being attacked by radroaches. You can either go in there and save his mom yourself, kill Butch, or you can even convince him to overcome his fear of the roaches, give him your BB gun, and watch him do it himself. This is genuinely cool, and an example of good quest design in a Fallout game. Yeah, it's pretty simple, and it's not a huge thing, but the game provides you with several options to approach the situation, as Fallout always should do. Unfortunately, many of the quests throughout the game aren't even close to following this same approach. Fallout 3 does not give you a lot of choice. Like, for example, later in the vault, you can choose to kill the Overseer for his password, or just find his password in a locker. Yeah, the game is teaching you that you don't always have to kill people to progress forward, but it basically turns the whole thing into kill or not kill. The game is littered with this very black and white mentality, with not many examples of a true morally gray decision, something the series was known for in every preceding entry. The classic example of this is Megaton. It's infamous because it's a baffling game design decision, and one that kind of encapsulates Fallout 3's problems with player freedom. Megaton is also the first real place you go to after exiting the vault, and it's a cool idea for a town in a Fallout game. It's built around an atomic bomb, with some of the inhabitants even worshipping the bomb itself. They call themselves the Children of the Atom, and it's fun to talk to Confessor Cromwell and learn more about the group. But there's no quest here with them at all. You can either blow up the town or disarm the bomb. It's a shame because a town built around an atomic bomb is a really cool idea, and I can imagine that given more time or just a better team of writers, there could be some really cool quests here. The fact that there's not a single side quest with the Children of Atom is a bummer. It's kind of surprising, right? I feel like usually when RPGs like this introduce a religious cult-like faction, that's a perfect opportunity to have some great side quests, but there aren't any here. Technically, Confessor Cromwell is involved with the big quest of Megaton, urging the player not to disarm the bomb, but something a bit more involved would be nice. I'm not sure if this was due to time constraints or what, but it's definitely kind of disappointing. Before I keep ragging on this game, I do feel the need to specify that I actually quite like it. It's Fallout 3, you know? I played this game to death, and most of my time spent was really enjoyable. That's because Fallout 3's world is really good. The best thing to do in this game is to walk around the open map and discover new locations. There's some really good ones here. One of my favorites is the Republic of Dave. It's a small town with only 5 or so people in the northwest corner of the map. He claims to be an elected leader, but he's the only one who's ever ran in the elections. If you convince some of the other inhabitants to run in the election and tamper with the ballot box, you can elect someone else to be president. The funniest thing about this is that the town name never changes, and the people don't even realize that they can run. They just assume Dave is their leader. You have to pass a speech check to convince the others that it's okay for them to run in the election. If someone else is elected, Dave will completely ignore the fact that there's not 5 votes in the ballot box, give up on the town entirely, and run to the most dangerous area of the game, Old Oni. He usually dies, but if you follow him and kill all of the Deathclaws that Old Oni is infested with, he can survive. In which case, he will just sit down in this little corner and claim Old Oni as the new Republic of Dave. Honestly, I love this stupid little quest, and I think it's hilarious. Dave running off to the most dangerous area in the game for no reason to start a new republic, which is basically entirely in his head, considering there are no other people in Old Oni, is a great moment. Dave and all the people in the town feel like they're from another planet, and it's just a cool little quest. And the multiple outcomes here feel very in line with the series. There's a few things like this in the game. There's Vault 108, which is inhabited by nothing but clones named Gary, and the only dialogue they have is the word Gary, which they yell as they attack you. This is really funny and all, but I will say it feels kind of pointless. Like, there's absolutely no room for role-playing here. There's just these crazy quirky guys in this vault, and your only option is to kill them. Yeah, there's some nice vault tech lore here, but it's not enough to satiate that hunger for more fun side quests. As I mentioned, there are a lot of cool side quests and moments in this game. Unfortunately, I don't think the game is all that good at pointing you in their direction. You pretty much just have to seek them out or run into them as you go, which is fine because the world is genuinely pretty fun to explore, but it's a downgrade from other entries in the series. Take Fallout 1 for example. Yeah, there's only like 10 locations, but you're bound to experience all of it, and it's all incredibly quality. You're very likely to visit Shady Sands on your way to Vault 15 because the game is designed around smoothly integrating its side content. I'm willing to bet a lot of casual players of Fallout 3, especially near the time of release, didn't even get to experience any of this cool stuff because they were busy with the honestly pretty poorly written main quest. It's like the previous games in that you have one seemingly simple goal that turns into something a lot bigger, but it's definitely too much like the previous games. In 2, it was a lot more forgivable because there was a new brooding faction that really kind of inspired fear in the player. There were random encounters on the map with the final boss showing his brutality in-game. The game made a point to hype up the Enclave, and it worked in providing a genuinely chilling villain in the game. I might have some qualms with the Enclave's motivations being kind of silly and pointless in Fallout 2, but they were overall a really intimidating and well-designed antagonist for the game. Fallout 3's main villain is the Enclave. Okay. Didn't we destroy them on the other side of the country years ago? Bethesda has this really annoying habit of utilizing previous factions and lore in their games, but doing so in a slightly head-scratching way. You can tell that had Interplay or Troika Games made Fallout 3, we would be facing something different and probably a lot more interesting. So whatever, Bethesda reused the Enclave. I wouldn't have as much of a problem with it if they didn't just suddenly kind of appear in the main quest with no real build-up or payoff. It feels like they started writing the main story and just realized at some point that they needed a big bad for the game, and chose the previous game's antagonist in an attempt to win over fans of the older titles. The problem is, a new, more interesting East Coast exclusive faction would have been a significantly better move and made for a more interesting overall experience. They did the same thing with the Brotherhood of Steel and Super Mutants, all things that really shouldn't be here but are. Now I do think that a few people get some things wrong about Fallout 3's Brotherhood. I don't blame them for being upset about how they were handled, I get it. In terms of the main quest, they are the generic good guys that swoop in to save the day. It's a far cry from the reclusive Brotherhood of the first 2 games. The same Brotherhood that sends you on a death mission, not expecting you to come back in Fallout 1. But I will say in Fallout 3's defense, you can find some supplemental lore here that suggests that the Brotherhood is not wholly good and can actually be pretty uninclusive and fucked up. You learn in the underworld that the Brotherhood shoots ghouls on sight, seeing them as basically the same as mutants. Speaking of mutants, the Brotherhood also sees them as a scourge on society, and basically has a shoot-on-sight policy for them as well. Which brings me to the super mutants in general. I also think the point I hear pretty often about Fallout 3 not respecting mutants, seeing them as targets or something to shoot at, while mostly true, is also true of Fallout 1. I don't really think it's something Bethesda did first. Yeah, in the first game you can talk to a couple mutants, but it almost always leads to violence. But it does make a lot more sense in 1 than in 3 because the main quest is centered around the Master's plan. It's literally a war of mutants versus humans in 1, so it's a lot more justifiable. In 3, many years have passed, yet most people still have a very hostile view of the mutants. Compare this to 2, where the town of Broken Hills is a community of mutants, ghouls, and humans living peacefully. It just seems like lazy writing on Bethesda's part. They tried to explain why mutants are even here with Vault 87, which is honestly a pretty cool vault in the game. Apparently there's another form of FEV creating mutants in the East Coast. It's not very convincing, and this was the beginning of Bethesda's constant new FEV iterations to explain their own bad lore. But in terms of atmosphere and audio design, these weird failed FEV experiments, it's actually really well done. It's just a shame that one of the coolest vaults in the game is unfortunately the product of unnecessary retcons and lazy writing. To give Bethesda some credit, there's a very iconic mutant character in this game. Fox is an intelligent and brutal super mutant who you can actually recruit as a companion, similar to Marcus in 2. There's definitely some expansion on the mutants here compared to 1, but I do feel like it's a step back compared to 2. Why is there no society, no goal or anything with the super mutants? Even in the first game, despite a majority of the mutants you meet not being very intelligent and them ultimately being the main antagonists, they rallied behind a realistic and feasible goal which they believed was overall better for the wasteland. There's nothing like this in 3. The mutants are just kind of here. They didn't rehash everything. There's some cool new enemy designs here like the Mirelurks, Radroaches, and a lot more. However, that's only when it comes to already hostile enemies. Yeah, there's new creatures, but not really an explanation for why they're here, and any major players relating to the plot directly are all rehashed from the previous games, specifically 2. This wouldn't be as disappointing if there was at least one new idea here. I mean, you go to a vault, look for a Gek, and fight the Enclave. It's an incredibly similar premise to Fallout 2. I just think they played it a little too safe, and unfortunately, it doesn't work to the game's benefit. One thing that seems to get a lot of flack, but I actually think is quite cool, is the reveal of John Henry Eden, president of the Enclave. Finding out he's an AI is a cool moment of the story, and I appreciate the fact that you can talk him into destroying the Enclave base and himself through dialogue. Unfortunately, it plays out a lot like the conversation with the Enclave president in 2. He reveals his entire evil plan to you during your first conversation. In 2, it's to wipe out all humans with trace amounts of FEV. In 3, it's to wipe out all people that have been exposed to radiation. It's very samey, but I will give 3 the benefit of Eden needing the player character's help to see his plan through. In 2, the president is so confident in his victory that he basically tells you just to gloat, or really just to dump exposition. When it comes to the ending, I don't have much to say. It's one of the most notoriously bad endings in gaming history, providing the player character with basically no choices. It's so bad, in fact, that Bethesda basically retconned it with the DLC, Broken Steel. I don't want to give you the play-by-play on how it ends, and I'll save my thoughts on Broken Steel for the DLC video, but it's worth mentioning that it's probably the worst ending in the series. Thankfully, with Broken Steel, you may continue playing after the main quest is over, and the ending to the story is overall much better. Honestly, when I play 3, If I have Broken Steel installed, I like to speedrun the main quest for XP, levels, and loot as fast as possible, and then after it's over, it feels like the game truly begins. It's a damn shame, because even though Fallout games excel in their side content, the previous games were so good at integrating the side content within the main quest so seamlessly that you didn't even realize it was happening. Fallout 3 is two games, a mediocre linear FPS about finding your dad and saving the world, and a pretty good open world RPG with cool moments and quests, as well as a great world to travel through. It's fun to just walk the map and make your own adventure here, and the Wasteland is mostly really fun to adventure in. One criticism I do have of the Capital Wasteland is the metro system in the southeast corner of the map. It's fun for maybe your first couple times playing through, but honestly, traversing the metros becomes quite boring after a while, and doesn't scratch the same itch as traveling in the large, expansive wastes. It's required to get to a lot of places on the map before you can fast travel, and you will have to go through them a lot to beat the main story. So unfortunately, if you want to beat the game, you can't really ignore them. And as I mentioned previously, beating the game is not necessarily that fun to do. Many of the characters in the main quest are so railroaded and locked down that it's hard to get any unique interactions out of them. First of all, they're all unkillable. Bethesda is obsessed with essential NPCs in this game. This has never been this bad in the series until this point. Yeah, there's examples here and there, as I mentioned before. In Fallout 2, if you aggro Arroyo at the beginning of the game and go to the world map, the game will just end, which is frustrating, but that's literally the only example I can think of. Fallout 3 is filled to the brim with unkillable NPCs because its main quest has not accounted for the player's freedom of choice whatsoever. The game really hates killing off certain NPCs. Even if you nuke Megaton, Moira survives the blast, definitely because she has a really cool quest the devs want you to do. I actually kind of like this particular instance and think it fits within the game's dark sense of humor, but it's symbolic of a larger issue here. Not only are many of the NPCs in the game unkillable, but also it's rare for any of them to respond to things you've done in the wastes, and if they do, it's usually ultimately pointless. Your dad will never get hostile or angry with you even if you nuked an entire town. There is dialogue here where he expresses his disappointment with you, but the story must continue, so apparently he doesn't actually really care about that and just wants to keep working with you. The game gives you the illusion that your choices matter, but ultimately when it comes to the main quest, nothing you do will actually affect the outcome. Your dad constantly tells you that he never wanted you to leave the vault and wanted you to stay safe, but has no problem bossing you around when you finally find him. Apparently now that you're here, you're actually entirely essential to the operation. It just doesn't make a lot of sense to me. Your dad in general is just not a very well written character. He's likable enough, I suppose. He's supposed to be seen as this moral bastion of hope, but instead he just comes off as incredibly one-dimensional, which ultimately makes his heroic sacrifice fall a little flat. The game really wants you to care in this moment, but you've likely only actually interacted with your dad 3 or 4 times since leaving the vault, and he always acts too busy to properly engage in dialogue with the player, so his sacrifice really doesn't mean much and isn't pulled off effectively. There are good characters in this game. It's just unfortunate that none of them are really involved in the main story. In the older games, you could easily be locked out of dialogue and unable to progress forward in a quest if you pissed off the wrong person or chose the wrong dialogue option. In this game, I don't even think about dialogue during most of the main quest, and speech is literally one of the pillars of the entire series. I'm not trying to dog on 3 too much, and I think this game has received more than its fair share of hate, but it's impossible to analyze this main story and find a lot of good things about it. Fallout 3 is best experienced leisurely, at your own pace and making your own fun. It's mechanically tight, with excellent presentation, satisfying gameplay, and intriguing side quests and locations. It's violent, funny, eerie, and genuinely haunting at times. It's also frustrating, lazy, poorly designed, and at times just plain boring. I don't think this game deserves to be maligned in the way that it has been for the last few years. A lot of people really love this game, myself included. I will always have a soft spot for it, and think it did a lot of really important and great things for the series. If it weren't for Fallout 3, I likely never would have learned about the series in general. and for that, it will always be close to me. I think it's important to remember that a game can be bad and good at the same time, depending on how you play it. When taking the main quest and rehashing into equation, Fallout 3's quality suffers immensely. But as a sandbox and a 3D translation of the fantastic first two titles, Fallout 3 is amazing. However, when compared to its younger Western brother, the cracks in its foundation begin to show. So Fallout 3 sold a ton and made Bethesda a lot of money. Of course there were going to be more games in the franchise, but Bethesda had already began to work on the next Elder Scrolls game, Skyrim. Realizing they'd likely have to wait several years before they had the internal manpower to develop a new Fallout game, they considered bringing another team into the fold. According to Todd Howard, only one team was considered to make the next Fallout game. Obsidian Entertainment was made up of many people who worked on the original two Fallout titles, with Black Isle's own Fergus Urquhart as CEO. They became well known in the industry for putting out quality, albeit usually rushed and buggy RPGs, usually sequels to existing IPs. They were known for creating these sequels under extreme time constraints. Well, Bethesda wanted more money from the Fallout IP, gave Obsidian the engine and assets from Fallout 3, set an 18-month deadline, and basically gave them the keys to the kingdom in creating a new adventure in the Fallout series. Once again set in the West Coast, New Vegas is undoubtedly the hardcore fan favorite of the series, and the uniting game between fans of the original two and fans of the Bethesda take on Fallout. And I will admit up front that I can't be unbiased about my analysis here. Fallout New Vegas is my favorite game ever made, and I play it very frequently. New Vegas to me is the best parts of 3 with significantly better characters and writing, but even that's an understatement. Just about every facet of the game is improved from its predecessor. Even just mechanically, there's been some small improvements here. The game added iron sights to make the FPS combat a little more fluid and smooth. It's still not the best feeling shooting game in the world, but it's a little more satisfying than Fallout 3 and perfectly serviceable for the game overall. Remember the karma system from Fallout 3? Honestly, it was kind of cool how people reacted to you differently depending on what your karma was in the game, but it did almost feel pointless. An unfortunate downgrade of Fallout 3 from its previous entries was the fact that because the main story was so railroaded, it was hard to even genuinely be an evil character. Despite nuking Megaton in my playthrough, I ended up with good karma at the end of my game just from killing certain NPCs and giving out purified water. New Vegas brings back the karma system, however it's not even close to the star of the show here. Karma is pretty much useless in New Vegas, because they've added the reputation system from Fallout 2 back in. This is undoubtedly a much more deep and engaging system than the karma system, so I'm glad to see that the karma system has kind of taken a back seat in New Vegas. There's even a faction armor system, meaning you can wear the armor of a faction that is hostile to you to sneak into enemy territory. If you have a high enough sneak skill, you can even complete enemy quests this way, though it's tricky to pull off. The karma system is still here, and honestly, it's really hard to be anything other than very good due to the fiends in South Vegas and feral ghouls giving you so much good karma when you kill them. You could argue that they probably should have just taken the karma system out entirely if it wasn't going to have much input into your experience, and I'd mostly agree with that. It's the same problem as 3, and if there wasn't the reputation system in place, I'd be disappointed with it. But reputation affects things to a lot higher degree than karma ever did in 3. There are new dialogue options, different quest lines, and you will feel the repercussions of angering specific factions for the entire duration of your playthrough. Obsidian was given 18 months to make this game, and the world, the amount of quests, the new weapons, the new creatures, it's all incredibly impressive for the short time they were given. Speaking of new weapons, that's another major upgrade from Fallout 3 in my opinion. Fallout 3 has some pretty good and memorable weapons. I at least don't mind the design of most of them. It's not like 4 yet, where they're basically making 50s sci-fi comic book weapons. Like, yeah, energy weapons have always had their place in the series, but look at this 10mm pistol from Fallout 4. Anyway, I'm getting distracted. 3's weapon selection is pretty solid, but New Vegas has the best and biggest selection of weapons in the entire series, bar none. They've also consolidated the big and small gun skills into one skill, making it a lot more viable to create a character that's adept with handling both. This game also makes unarmed and melee incredibly viable skills because of the weapons it introduces. Fallout 3 has some cool melee weapons like the shish kebab, but it doesn't come close to this game's selection in my opinion. I almost never do a melee character, and even I use the thermic lance frequently in this game. Aside from that, the number of weapons in the game has almost doubled since 3, and every character of mine acquires a small arsenal before going to the Battle of Hoover Dam. Also, this could just be me, but the touch of the caps being significantly inflated compared to 3 in this game is really interesting to me. I actually feel like the caps seem kind of similar to their value in the first 2 games. Some weapons cost upwards of like 30,000 caps here, which is well beyond what any weapon costs in 3. I remember certain weapons near the end of Fallout 2 costing a similar amount of money, so I almost wonder if it's like a East versus West Coast thing, even though Fallout 2 doesn't even technically use caps as currency. They've also added in a new skill, Survival, which to me seems like a natural continuation of the outdoorsman skill from the first 2 games. It's an interesting skill because it can pretty much be entirely ignored, honestly, but for hardcore mode it becomes significantly more useful. Oh yeah, they've added hardcore mode to New Vegas. It gives the game a lot more of an urgent survival vibe and requires you to collect food, water, and get enough sleep. Along with this, it makes your companions killable. It's not necessarily my thing, don't get me wrong, I've done plenty of hardcore mode playthroughs before, but in my own personal opinion, getting resources like food and water doesn't actually make the game any harder, it's just slightly more annoying, so I usually just go without it. Another huge reason I don't often play with hardcore mode on is because I really enjoy most of the companion quests in this game, and having them be killable makes it a little harder to get them done. I know that's kind of rich coming from me, considering I just ragged on Fallout 3 hard for its unkillable NPCs. The difference is that companions are only unkillable when they're in your party, and they're not marked essential outside of that. Compare this to the number of essential NPCs in Fallout 3. New Vegas only has one of these properly unkillable NPCs, and they've actually written this character around it being plausible that this could happen, but I'll be talking more about Yes Man later. Point being, New Vegas is less concerned with holding the player's hand than even the early titles, and this is evident with the game's intro. This is easily the quickest, to the point, and most free intro in the series, besides maybe Fallout 1, but I'd argue even more so considering you aren't given a time limit in the beginning of this game. You're a courier with an important package. Some Vegas big shot shoots you in the head, steals your package, and a local doctor and a big robot known as a Securitron manage to save your life. The only motivation the game gives you from here on out is to find the guy who did this to you. Of course, like all the games in the series thus far, this is only the first act, and the playable character ends up making a huge impact on the wasteland. The difference here is the urgency of the first act. New Vegas takes it as slow or as quickly as the player character wants. You can skip almost the entire first act by going straight to Vegas if you really want to, but the game is designed around this being incredibly difficult to do. However, it is very possible. One path has tons of death claws, and unlike 3, they don't scale to your level and are incredibly difficult to kill. And the other has a new enemy, Cazadors. These guys are really nasty and will kill you quick. However, if you have the Mercenary's grenade rifle from the Courier Stash DLC, you can take them out at level 1 and head straight up to Vegas. Even stealth is an option here. You can loot a stealth boy off of Joe Cobb and use it to make your way north, hugging the walls and praying to God a Deathclaw doesn't see you. The game certainly accounts for your ability to do this, and I often do on repeat playthroughs. However, the early quests that lead you to Vegas are incredibly fun and well designed, and that's the way I recommend going your first time around. This open nature of the game extends to the entire main quest, and pretty soon you'll find yourself entangled in a situation much bigger than you. The problem of 3 not really delivering its side content easily to the player is resolved, due to the main quest intelligently bringing you all around the map, to several different factions and communities. Before you even get to Vegas, the main questline moves you through Prim, Nipton, and Novak, which all have interesting and engaging side content. In 3, the main quest is almost entirely secluded to the bottom east corner of the map, meaning you spend so much of it in these metro stations with not much to do or run into. In New Vegas, you can barely walk in any direction on the map without running into something fun or interesting. A lot of the cool stuff in the first 2 that was removed in 3 is now back in this entry. Things like reputation, traits, even some of the iconic weapons like the 223 pistol and Bozar are back, and I'm glad to see it. Along with this, we actually get some new factions. In fact, only one of the major factions in the game is actually actually from a previous entry, and it's the NCR, only represented on the West Coast entries in the series. They're even bigger and more important here than they were in Fallout 2. The main conflict of the game is centered around control of Hoover Dam and the New Vegas Strip. Turns out the item stolen from you in the beginning of the game is a chip containing software to upgrade the Securitron Army, a group of heavily armed robots that patrol New Vegas and keep it protected. They were invented by Mr. House, the founder of Robco, who has remained the de facto ruler of New Vegas for over 100 years. The other major new faction is Caesar's Legion, a group of edgy Roman Empire LARPers who enslave and kill indiscriminately for more power around the wasteland. I've replayed New Vegas countless times, and I just can't bring myself to side with the Legion. I've only done one Legion playthrough just to do it, but I will say that it's not just a generic evil faction like the Enclave in 3. It is conceivable as a faction and undeniably incredibly efficient in its goals. They're a better written faction than the Enclave, because they're not just evil for the sake of it. They're evil because of their methods to gaining power, which are incredibly effective. In fact, there are significantly less side quests in a typical Legion playthrough because they don't really need your help. On the other hand, when you side with the NCR, there are tons of side quests. The NCR has spread itself super thin by expanding too much and not being able to hold their land and keep up with the amount of resources needed to create a functioning society. They're easily the most populous faction in the entire series and basically work as a functioning, if slightly unstable and corrupt, government. I didn't touch on the NCR's appearances in the previous titles because they weren't quite as integral to the overall story, and this video is already going to be long enough. But with each entry they've appeared in, they've grown significantly in size. In Fallout 1, the first town you're likely to visit in the game, Shady Sands, is actually the birthplace of the NCR. And the girl in the town that gets kidnapped by the cons is actually the very first president of the NCR. You can talk to her again in Fallout 2, 80 years later. Now the NCR is a fully fledged society, fighting with Vault City and New Reno for control of Northern California. By the events of New Vegas, they've expanded into Nevada, and with their size at an all-time high, struggle to keep up with Caesar's Legion's brutal, totalitarian regime. This conflict is incredibly interesting, but you don't have to pick either side, or even Mr. House for that matter. You can choose to take out Mr. House, keep the Platinum Chip, and install a completely subservient AI into his mainframe, taking control of New Vegas for yourself. Along with this being an interesting and fun way to beat the game, this is also how New Vegas accounts for only having one essential NPC. If you kill him, it might seem like he's dead, but his personality will just be uploaded to another Securitron infinitely. And because of his submissive nature, he will never become hostile towards the player. Not only does this actually make sense, but it means that New Vegas can always be completed, even if you make dumb decisions or kill important people. The good thing about this is that New Vegas reintroduces consequence into the series. In the early titles, you were often locked out of dialogue or unable to do certain quests if you said the wrong things to important characters. The game was willing to let you fuck up and have to live with it if you didn't save recently, and it was always still possible to complete the game. Fallout 3 was way too afraid to let you do anything like this. Hell, you can't even decide to go against the Brotherhood. Yeah, you can poison the water supply, but the game must be beaten in a particular way. You always have to walk with Liberty Prime and take out the Enclave. To be fair to 3, this has been a problem with the entire series up to this point besides 1 and New Vegas. In Fallout 2, it's almost the same story. Yes, there's plenty of freedom in the game with its side quests and extra content, but you have to destroy the Enclave at the end of the game to get any sort of ending. Fallout 1 at least accounts for you joining the Master's cause or letting yourself become a mutant. Yeah, it's not the true canon ending and it's ultimately unsatisfying, but the point is that the game lets you do it. New Vegas is the first game in the series that actually brings the moral ambiguity of the series' side quests to its main quest line. There are at least 4 major different outcomes to the main quest, and there are genuine pros and cons to each one. Even with the Legion, if you side with them, the Wasteland actually becomes safer for traders and caravans, because they basically wipe out any raider communities. I don't believe that this makes the Legion a good option, but I could see why someone would. And that's what makes this game's main quest so good. You can even do stupid things just for fun, and the game will actually account for this. For example, if you're doing a Mr. House or Yes Man playthrough and relying on the Securitron army to help you take control of Vegas, you can go to the Legion's main fort and find a vault with a massive army of extra Securitrons, with the technology to create even more. You're supposed to go down here to upgrade them all and significantly increase increase your firepower, or you can destroy the vault entirely. It would make sense for you to do this if you're doing a Legion playthrough and don't want the Securitrons in the way when the Legion takes over New Vegas. But you can also do this if you're doing an independent playthrough, and yes man will have some unique dialogue here. The game actually accounts for you doing something incredibly stupid for no reason, and I had never seen this dialogue until I'd already gone through the game dozens of times. These are just examples of the freedom that New Vegas gives you off the top of my head. I still don't think I've seen everything. It's insane to me that through the hundreds and hundreds of hours I've spent with this game in the last 10 years, I still get caught off guard with stuff like this. And I haven't even touched on the side content yet. To be frank, it would be impossible, or at least incredibly difficult and long-winded for me to analyze every side quest or unmarked quest that's worth playing in New Vegas, but I definitely want to talk about some of my favorites. Come Fly With Me is one of the best quests in the series. You go to Novac to get info on who shot you. End up talking to this guy Manny Vargas, who says that a bunch of ghouls moved into the RepCon facility nearby, and he needs you to clear it out in exchange for information. Sounds like classic RPG stuff. Hey man, I need you to go get rid of these dudes for me, thanks. But when you get there, you realize the ghouls are not feral, and have moved to the RepCon facility because of the nearby rockets. There's some sort of religious cult that believes in a place called the Far Beyond, some sort of ghoul haven, and they want to take a journey on the rockets to be there forever. You'll notice that the first guy you talk to isn't actually a ghoul at all. He's a delusional human that believes he is a ghoul. If you choose to help the Bright Brotherhood, as they're known in-game, you have to clear out the Nightkin in the basement. This can be done peacefully as well, I just didn't go that route this time around. Once you clear the basement, you just have to grab a few things nearby to start the launch. When you go to get the igniting agent, you find it on this corpse nearby wearing a radiation suit. If you go through this guy's journal, you'll find that he called himself Mr. Radical, and basically thought he was invulnerable thanks to his suit, and he died because he poured a highly radioactive igniting agent all over his body. Good stuff. Anyway, when you get back to the facility, this is where, with a high enough speech skill, you can convince Chris Haversam into seeing the truth, that he's a human, not a ghoul, and he will have to stay behind, as even the radiation near the launch pad will be enough to kill him in minutes. His first instinct is to rig the rockets to explode, to get revenge on this perceived betrayal. However, you can convince him not to take revenge, and that the ghouls want nothing but the best for him, and even suggest for him to go to Novac and start fresh. When you go back, he's actually here, and he has this to say.
Welcome to Novac. It's not very exciting here, but the people are friendly enough. My engineering skills have been coming in handy too. I've got plenty to do. Thanks for telling me about this place.
This is a great ending to the quest and emphasizes Fallout's predisposition to allow the character to talk through just about anything. I killed some Nightkin in my playthrough of the quest, but if you really want to, you can do this entire quest without killing anyone or anything. On the other hand, what I've described here isn't the only outcome. You can convince Chris to stew in his anger and kill the rest of the ghouls. With a high enough science skill, you can either increase their chances of flying away successfully, or rig the rockets to ram into each other. If you have a low enough intelligence, you even get the option to push buttons randomly on the terminal. Hell, you don't even have to talk to these ghouls. You can just clear them out of RepCon violently, one by one, and it will satisfy Manny good enough. There's also a speech check you can pass that will give you the information you need to continue anyway. You can also just look at Manny's terminal for the info, pickpocket the note in his pocket, or kill him for the exact same result. So the quest is completely skippable. The game gives you a litany of options to progress forward. However, I almost never skip it because I always have such a great time doing this quest. Even big fans of New Vegas sometimes don't enjoy this quest, but I can't help but disagree. I think this is one of the most memorable and fun parts of the game, and it tends to go slightly differently for me just about every time I do it. Let's also talk about GI Blues. What a fun quest and a fun faction. The Kings are one of my favorite groups in the Fallout series, and I really enjoy both the silliness of their entire premise, but also how viable it is and how entangled they truly are in the main story. It's simultaneously hilarious and also very intriguing how he mistakes the Elvis School of Impersonation as being a place of worship. Also, claiming that Elvis's name is nowhere to be found on the posters, and he's referred to simply as the King, is a great way for the writers to avoid hot water here. In terms of the quest he gives you, it starts very simple. There's a bodyguard near the north gate that's getting suspiciously more business than all the other ones. You've been instructed to see why. Upon hiring him, if your player character has an intelligence of at least 6, you can point out that he's a fraud. basically working with some thugs to work up a show for repeat business. When reporting this to the king, you slowly begin to gain his trust. It's here when he mentions that some of his friends have been attacked by squatters in Freeside. When you go to the old Mormon fort to talk to them, there's some great dialogue here that reveals the truth. Turns out it's NCR soldiers. Now you can confront the NCR squatter camps to see exactly why they've done this. If you take the extra time to talk to Julie Farkas, a member of the Followers of the Apocalypse, yes, they're back, she will mention that she's actually friends with Elizabeth Kieran from the NCR, and they're handing out food at one of the squatter camps. When you go here and mention Julie's name, Kieran will open up about how the NCR actually did send an envoy to coordinate a relief effort, so that supplies would be handed out to all Freeside locals, not just NCR citizens. Problem is, this envoy returned badly beaten, so NCR assumed that that was a message directly from the king himself. When you report the news to the king, he realizes it's all been a big misunderstanding, but during this conversation, Pacer gets into a shootout with NCR and a couple of the gang members. If you run into the shootout and talk to Elizabeth Kieran and explain the situation, the NCR will stand down and violence between the two factions will significantly decrease. I just gave the rundown of the ideal scenario, especially for an NCR playthrough. However, if you're doing a playthrough where you're hostile to the NCR, you may choose not to mention the beaten envoy to the king, and if that does happen, the quest cannot end peacefully. There are a lot of ways to approach this quest, and so many factors here. If you're not careful about every little aspect of it, you could end up with negative NCR reputation without even meaning to. If you neglect to speak to Julie Farkas, you won't even learn the full extent of the story here, and will be forced into a violent outcome. This is another example of Fallout New Vegas letting go of the player's hand and letting them f*** up. It's a really good time and something I enjoy wholeheartedly about the game. It makes pulling off such an in-depth quest with so many factors peacefully that much more satisfying. Don't get me wrong, I've been going on about the freedom provided to you in this game, and I do think that it's probably the least railroaded in the series I've felt since 1, honestly. But not every quest in the game is like this, and that's okay. I'm not really trying to present a linear versus non-linear debate here and argue which one is objectively better, just trying to reiterate what I think makes New Vegas the ultimate Fallout experience. That being said, some of the best quests in the series are ultimately pretty linear ones, and one of the best ones here is Talent Pool. All this quest really involves is gathering some really funny and interesting characters over to the Tops Casino. There's 2 really endearingly bad stand-up comics, and 2 musical acts. They even went as far as to create original, albeit derivative, tunes for the game here. These songs were actually performed by Josh Sawyer, lead designer and project director for New Vegas. This is so cool to me. The lead designer actually demonstrated his vocal chops on the game just for one side quest. This quest isn't hard to miss or anything, it's just kinda tucked away at the tops, and it's really awesome to me how far they went for this game's side content. One last side quest I want to look at in this video, and it's Arcade Ganon's companion quest. Remember how Fallout 3 head-scratchingly used the Enclave again as a main villain, despite us destroying the oil rig in Fallout 2 and 3 taking place on the other side of the country? Well, this quest is an example of how to write a quest featuring the remnants of the Enclave after Fallout 2 properly. It's not shoved in your face, it's not something the game presents to you super easily even. It's a very late game quest that you can only take if you build trust with a certain companion, Arcade Ganon. You gain these trust points by doing certain things with him in your party. He listens to how you speak to certain NPCs, and if you say things that align with his personal values and do it enough, near endgame he will mention that he was born in Navarro, the huge Enclave base in Fallout 2. Up until this point, Arcade Ganon has been a level-headed scientist type, with upstanding morals, who believes in a truly independent and free New Vegas. A fierce opponent of Caesar's Legion and its ideals, it's really interesting to learn that his family and upbringing were in the totalitarian and authoritarian Enclave. He mentions that there are still former members of the Enclave that are alive, and suggests getting them to actually do some good and help against Caesar's Legion at the Battle of Hoover Dam. Then all of a sudden, when recruiting the remnants of the Enclave, you realize what a lot of these random named characters you've encountered are in the game for. Of course, they wouldn't tell you they were a part of the Enclave, given its horrible history. But when you bring Arcade with you as part of this quest, they will open up about their experiences. A couple of them, like Cannibal Johnson and Daisy Whitman, don't even seem like they enjoyed being in the Enclave as much as they just wanted a purpose in life. As you talk to each of these characters, Arcade will engage in dialogue shortly after and give you some background and his 2 cents on his history with the characters. Following this, you can either encourage him to embrace his past or let go and focus on the present. present, helping the followers of the apocalypse. And then you come across this guy, Orion Moreno. If there's any character here that feels like they belonged in the Enclave, it's him. He never once questioned his orders and believed every word that was fed to him about the Enclave being the real US government and the next step forward for the country. He also absolutely hates the NCR, and though everyone else will agree to fight alongside NCR troops at the dam, he will walk out when discovering that the courier will be siding with them. You can either talk him down or kill him here. But that's not all. This is slightly irrelevant, but far too funny not to talk about. According to Josh Sawyer, there was a bug late into development where, if this encounter ended violently and Orion was killed, at the Battle of Hoover Dam when the remnants start jumping out of the vertibird, Orion's headless corpse would spawn and plop down at the Battle of Hoover Dam. This was fixed by the game's release, but someone made a mod to bring it back in. Anyway, depending on how you've been nudging Arcade Gannon, he will either fight alongside the remnants, wearing his family power armor, or give his armor to the player to be present at the old Mormon fort, providing much needed medical assistance during the battle. This is really cool. In Fallout 3, I'm skipping through dialogue so frantically because I know at the end of the day it doesn't have an effect on the story. But in this quest, your conversation choices have a palpable impact on the final battle of the game. Like many of the other quests I've mentioned, that's just one way of doing it too. You can convince the remnants to help the Legion too, although you will betray Arcade's trust and Cannibal Johnson will leave as well. Once again, it seems like even in this kind of tucked away quest that took me several playthroughs to find out about for the first time, the game never limits your options. And fighting alongside the remnants of the Enclave, allowing them to do something actually good for their country by preventing total control of the dam by an authoritarian dictatorship feels amazing. The Enclave in Fallout New Vegas is not an evil faction. It's not even a faction. It's a squad of people who were lucky enough not to be on the oil rig you blew up in Fallout 2. It's a group of people who likely did very, very bad things, redeeming themselves near the end of their life, swooping in on a vertibird with miniguns, once again participating in war. Except this time, it's actually a war worth fighting. It's a fantastic way to provide some fan service and talk about and incorporate old iconic factions into a Fallout game, without making it feel so rehashed and played out. This is a perfect quest in Fallout New Vegas, and one of the many amazing moments that makes me so happy this game was made. Alright, let's wrap this up. So once you get the platinum chip back from Benny, you can choose to give it back to its rightful owner, Mr. House, or kill him and install Yes Man into his Securitron network. I almost always opt for the latter. I just don't like Mr. House. He's incredibly demanding, which always makes me laugh because he absolutely needs the courier to see his plans to fruition, so bye-bye. It's around here when the main quest becomes incredibly open-ended and unintrusive. There are a lot of factions, new and old, in the Mojave Wasteland that we need to get acquainted with before we can progress in the main story. This is a really smart design move because it makes sure that the player is sent in the direction of interesting characters and side quests, but actually doing quests for these people and getting them on your side in the Battle of Hoover Dam is entirely optional. All you have to do is go check them out if you really want to. Once again, the game doesn't force you to do things that you don't want to. It just subtly and effectively sends you in the direction of its interesting and engaging side content. Now, if you take another ending, say an NCR ending, simply ignoring these factions isn't an option, and you will be asked to do more specific things like wipe out the entire Brotherhood of Steel chapter in the Mojave. That's right, the Brotherhood is actually in this game. They're significantly closer in behavior to their Fallout 1 and 2 counterparts here, and certainly not cut and dry good guys. They have actually become even more isolated and xenophobic as a result of NCR's massive expansion. They stick to themselves and their one bunker in the Mojave. When you meet them for the first time, they confiscate all of your weapons and chems and put an explosive collar on your neck. There are many quests here to help them, and even some that make good steps towards undoing their destructive ways. But the overall sentiment in this game is that the Brotherhood's mentality is just not viable in the Wasteland anymore, and they'll never be the almighty powerful faction that they were in the first game. I'm sorry to keep talking about 3, a game that I like, in such a negative light so frequently, but it seems like everything I hate about how they've written previously interesting factions in 3 is addressed in New Vegas. The Brotherhood aren't even written the same way they are in Fallout 1. They're written with an unfortunately plausible believability that their hoarding, insular, and isolationist viewpoints that they were founded on will be the death of them. That even though there are good people in their faction that want to change things for the better, they'll always be ignored in favor of rigidly upholding their broken beliefs. This is the kind of writing that makes Fallout one of the greatest video game franchises of all time, and you can ignore this questline completely. There's also engaging and in-depth quests with the Great Khans, the Omertas, the White Glove Society, the Boomers, and more. But I have to stop talking about this game eventually, or this video is going to be 3 hours long. The point is, no time spent in this game ever feels wasted. And I think that's because you never feel forced into doing something you don't want to do. It's not that every quest in the game contains the same level of quality, it's just that the ones that matter do. Unlike in 3, you don't spend the main quest being told what to do, going through empty metros, killing super mutants, and then sacrificing yourself for no reason. Anything that's not optional is designed with freedom and choice in mind. Before I head on to Fallout 4, let's finish this up by talking about Hoover Dam. So once you've tied up all your loose ends and played all of the fantastic DLC, which I will be talking about in a future video, you can enter the Battle of Hoover Dam. It's a really cool final moment and allows you to see how your choices have impacted the fight. If you've gone out of your way to recruit factions like the Boomers, Great Khans, Enclave Remnants, hell, even the Brotherhood of Steel, they will all appear at the battle to help even the odds. It makes the final battle so much more satisfying to see these factions come into play at the end. If siding against the Legion, you'll have the chance to engage in dialogue with Legate Lanius before fighting him. He's essentially this game's Frank Horrigan, a massive, foreboding commander for the Legion. Unlike Horrigan, though, you can actually talk him out of fighting and convince him and the Legion to retreat. I'm really glad that they included this option, because that was something missing from Fallout 2, something that I really enjoyed in Fallout 1 and even 3. It's a series staple to talk your way out of the final encounters, and I'm glad to see it's back here. The logic here actually makes sense too. It's nothing mind-blowingly philosophical or anything, but just like the Master, you point out the major flaw in the villain's plan to him and make him truly weigh his options. It's a great final moment and an excellent way to wrap things up. This game also has great end slides, and there's a solid chance that your first time through, you'll see characters alluded to that you probably didn't even get a chance to interact with yet. That's because there's too much in New Vegas to experience in one playthrough. It absolutely demands to be played and replayed again. And I know for a fact that I'll be booting this game back up over and over for the rest of my life. I could keep going, but truthfully, I'm probably not done talking about New Vegas on this channel, and my goal was to give each game an in-depth but brief look, and if I don't stop myself now, I won't stop for hours. To conclude my thoughts, New Vegas takes the open-ended quest design of Fallout 1, the huge amount of content and replayability from Fallout 2, and the engine, mechanics, and combat from Fallout 3, and achieves it all better than the series ever has before. I feel like it's pretty obvious that the games following this point in the video are not going to be my favorites, and nothing's beating New Vegas, but I still think it's worth talking about. Fallout 4 is a complicated game to me, and one that I have a lot of love and hate for. Yeah, it's another polarizing Bethesda release in the Fallout series, but there's some things I really enjoy about it. For starters, the big obvious change here is the gunplay. It looks and feels smooth. Fallout 4 is probably the best game in the entire series from purely a gameplay standpoint. Fallout 4 is a full-on first-person shooter. Yeah, Fallout 3 brought the series to this point and is technically an FPS RPG, but Fallout 4 feels like a shooter first. The problem with this is that Bethesda doubled down on many of the problems they introduced to the series with 3. There's even less choice and freedom in this game than 3, and never has the series felt so linear. Fallout 4's biggest problem is dialogue. The new system here, though dynamic and brilliantly executed in-engine, is incredibly shallow and provides the player with less choice. You don't even get to see your full dialogue choice, just like the weird Cliff Notes version of it. This is because Fallout 4 has a voice protagonist for the first time in the series. Because of this, the main character feels like they're already a kind of established person. Previous games in the series, with the possible exception of 3, have backstories and whatnot, but ultimately feel like blank slates. In 4, your character is an army vet, a family-centered person, and someone who's essentially built a personality in the pre-war America. You can infer certain things about the main characters in the previous games, like in 2, the Chosen One was raised in a tribal village, or in New Vegas, where the Courier has been active in the Mojave before the events of the game. But it's nothing to this degree. It feels like you're playing as John Fallout or something, and the lack of dialogue options doesn't help matters. One thing that is a definite downgrade, at least from an RPG standpoint, is the fact that level scaling is even more present here than in 3. This makes creatures like Deathclaws a lot easier to fight. This is frustrating frustrating because it takes some of the fun out of completing side quests to become a high-level character. Every single playthrough of New Vegas I do, I love to get to a high enough level and head to Quarry Junction to clear it out. There are times where I go there at a lower level, but you have to be an incredibly skilled player to survive Quarry Junction, especially when you're at a lower level. It feels like a real accomplishment. The game accounts for your ability to technically clear it out early, but it's designed to be incredibly difficult to do so to help with the game's sense of progression. Fallout 4 gives you power armor and a minigun and lets you take out a Deathclaw in literally its first quest in the Wasteland. This is an infamous moment, but it's easy to see why. It's not bad game design for your standard FPS action game, but this is Fallout. Getting power armor in the first game feels like an incredible achievement, and it's not something you're likely to get until very late in the game. In New Vegas, power armor is also a late game achievement, and it's hard to do. There's only 2 quest lines that give you power armor training, and they both require that you are a decent ways through the main quest to get it. Even Fallout 3 gives you power armor training only when you're a good ways through the main quest. I'm not complaining about this because I think that game design like this is inherently bad, and giving 4 some credit, this is one of the best iterations of power armor. It truly feels like a vessel or a vehicle rather than a standard suit of armor, and it's really well designed. You feel like a tank wearing it, and it's honestly really cool. It's a rush to enter the power armor and take down a Deathclaw with almost 1,000 5mm rounds. It's fun to destroy raiders with completely overkill weaponry and armor. It's just not Fallout. Adding to that, Fallout 4 has my least favorite weapon design in the series. Fallout has always had realistic, real-world sort of weapons, and 4 does too. There's hunting rifles, shotguns, pistols, and pipe rifles, which I actually like the idea of on paper. It makes sense that raiders and wastelanders would create their own makeshift guns. I don't mind these because I see them as pretty feasible. My problem with the weapon design mostly lies in the noticeable lack of cool, real-world-esque guns that every game in the series has had up to this point. Like I mentioned prior, there are shotguns and pistols and things like that, but just look at this game's design of the assault rifle. This thing is really crap compared to the litany of choices you've had in previous games. I mean, even in the first Fallout, the assault rifle is basically just an M4 style gun, but it's a nice design. New Vegas takes it even further by having several different variants of assault rifles, like the assault carbine, service rifle, and marksman carbine. That's just scratching the surface too. Comparing that to this doesn't do the game any favors. There seems to be a lot of people who have this notion that Fallout shouldn't have modern weaponry in the games because it's a 50s aesthetic, and this is just blatantly untrue and showcases many people's misunderstanding of the series' setting and theme. The entire game's aesthetic bothers me. Yes, the Commonwealth looks beautiful, and honestly I think the game holds up really well graphically. It's a massive upgrade, and the parts of it that work for me really work, but this game might look a little too good in certain ways. Let me elaborate on that. Way at the beginning of this video, I mentioned really loving the aesthetic of Fallout 1. Its opening cutscene and the game cover with the red sky. Fallout 3 does a pretty decent job at capturing some of that essence in its world. Yeah, the green tint's a little annoying and the metros aren't very visually interesting, but Fallout 3 at least feels like a post-apocalypse. A lot of Fallout 4's world feels like a wacky 50s themed sci-fi shooter. There is no part of this game that comes even close to the excellent but dreadful atmosphere of the original 2 entries. I don't think that 3 and New Vegas handled this aspect perfectly or anything. In fact, compared to New Vegas, 3 might even be slightly more faithful to the original games in this regard, but 4 loses some of Fallout's identity as a series. A lot of people have touched on this before, and it's not some new claim to make, but Fallout was never specifically 1950s themed. It's an alternate timeline where culture stagnated and technology progressed in an entirely different way. There's absolutely no reason why 2077 should look like this. 1950s culture has always been an influence on the series, but I think Bethesda has taken all of the nuance out of Fallout's setting because it's easier and funnier to just keep Fallout in the 50s. This kind of thing might work for games like Bioshock, a game that actually takes place in 1960, but Fallout is about the future, not the past. This was not as egregious of a problem in 3. I mean, you had goofy characters like Butch and the Tunnel Snakes who are basically walking caricatures of 50s stereotypes, and they definitely simplified some aspects of the very nuanced setting and time period of the series. We're not in an almost flanderized, goofy 1950s setting just because it's easy to write jokes around it. Alright, that's enough complaining for now. The truth is, it's really easy to get pedantic about Fallout 4 as a huge fan of the originals and New Vegas. But taken on its own, outside of the context of the series, Fallout 4 is a really fun action game. There's new crafting and settlement systems which you can genuinely spend hours on. There's a lot of fun collectibles like these magazines scattered throughout the wasteland, and to give it some credit compared to the rest of the series, areas like the glowing sea are not only visually really great, but actually add to the game's otherwise more shallow sense of progression. Fallout 3 and New Vegas have heavily irradiated areas in their respective wastelands, but nothing that felt as dangerous or cool as the glow in Fallout 1, and this really harkens back to that, and even beats it from a presentation standpoint. Truthfully, there's a lot to like here, and I even kind of respect Fallout 4 in a way for not even really trying to be a Fallout game. I know that sounds insane, but hear me out. Fallout 3 recycled so many things from the older games. It succeeded in capturing the feeling of the old games through its atmosphere and presentation. My biggest gripe with 3 is that the game absolutely fails to deliver any sort of meaningful choices in its main quest. It's masquerading as a Fallout game, but certainly doesn't feel like one with its quest design choices. Fallout 4 definitely doesn't feel like a Fallout game, but Bethesda wasn't even trying to make it feel like one. They did something new, and for that I actually have to give them some credit. Is it a failure as a Fallout game? Kind of. But it feels a lot more confident and centered in its choices than 3 does. Let's touch on the main story. Fallout 4 starts with a pre-war section, and I remember really liking this when the game came out. No other game really tried to directly show you what life was like before the bombs dropped. And though I feel like that was absolutely intentional to keep that stagnated culture that the game exists in more of a mystery, it's cool to experience it. Although, like I said before, it's a pretty shallow depiction of some retro futurism, and just looks like some sort of 50s utopia. I mean, it's hard to even call it that. It looks like the 1950s with a Mr. Handy thrown in. It is an effective intro, however, and even though it has another kind of boring, vault-based intro, I don't think it's as annoying to replay as 3's. The main story is basically the inverse of 3. Once in the vault, you enter cryogenic stasis, but one day you wake up to find some guy who steals your son and kills your spouse. That's pretty much it. Find your son. As much as I want to shit on this, it's actually pretty in line for the series. Start with a simple motivation and find yourself wrapped up in something a lot bigger than you. I'll say that Fallout 4 actually has a lot more choice in its main story because of the new factions. There's the Institute, a weird, elusive scientific society that's responsible for the synths in the game, which are weird sort of semi-organic robots. There's the Railroad, which is centered around freeing those synths from the Institute and integrating them into society. There's of course the Brotherhood of Steel, which actually feels a little more in line with their old tech-hoarding selves in this game, and as a result of this, believe that all synths are abominations that should be destroyed. Now that actually makes sense for them. And there's the Minutemen, a kind of volunteer militia group dedicated to protecting people in the wasteland, and they have their own ending as well, as potentially being convinced to support or at least coexist with any of the other major factions, including the Institute. I went with the Railroad for this playthrough as I find the Brotherhood to have a lot of the same problems in this game as they do in 3. I mean, Paladin Danse has a neat storyline, and don't get me wrong, as I said before, they do seem to emphasize the technological hoarding aspect of the faction more, what with the presence of the synths and all. That kind of stuff was hinted at in 3, and technically is still the main reason for their existence, but it was in the background while the Brotherhood shot at all the bad guys for you. Fallout 4 has this same problem, however. They even bring back Liberty Prime for seemingly no reason. Once again, Bethesda reused a lot of things for this game, not just from previous entries, but from 3 as well. There's even a moment here where you go into like a simulation thing, just like Tranquility Lane in Fallout 3. Fortunately, something they didn't rehash from 3 was the straightforwardness of that game's main quest. Yeah, there's still no real way to do things outside of the main paths, but at least that's paths plural. Your only real choice in 3's main story is whether or not to poison everyone in the wasteland through the water supply. In 4, there's at least multiple factions to choose from, even if their questlines are all very straightforward Fallout 3 style. Speaking on the factions, one that definitely could have benefited from better writing is the Institute. It's a pretty cool idea on paper, but like everything else in this game, it's handled with little nuance. The big reveal of the game is that your son was kidnapped 60 years ago, and he's become the leader of the Institute in that time. You basically just get the choice to join them or not. There's no way to convince them that their resources would be better utilized all throughout the wasteland. This is such a wasted opportunity because there's a great foundation here. They just don't really do anything with it. Yes, you can go under their nose to try to free as many of the Institute synths as you can if you go with the Railroad playthrough, which is what I did this time around. And this is a really cool questline, honestly, and something I wish the game had more of. That being said, I think that overall the main questlines in Fallout 4 are a lot better than 3 and actually provide a solid amount of choice. Not for a Fallout game, but for an RPG FPS action title. Does it hold up to 1, 2, or New Vegas? Not at all. But the quest design isn't my biggest problem here when taken on its own. My biggest problems with Fallout 4 is the overhaul of the dialogue system and the removal of skills, traits, and reputation. Building a character in Fallout 4 is really boring compared to earlier titles. As I said, they removed skills like speech, lockpick, and energy weapons from the game, and replaced it with this weird perk/special hybrid system. And though you can still build a character different from your last using this system, it just feels a lot more homogeneous. Like your character is bound to be really good at a lot of things, especially when you reach a higher level. It's not necessarily a bad thing, they've streamlined things and I understand why. This is just a different game from previous Fallouts, but it's just not as fun in any way. I mean, one of the appeals of the series up to this point was building a character and actually role-playing, and the game's accounted for these different playstyles. Like a character that specializes in unarmed combat is not going to be as effective with guns until much later when you can put enough points into that skill. In Fallout 3, you're just a combat machine. And again, I understand why they did this. It's fun, but it's not nearly as rewarding. That being said, I've already praised the gameplay and there's a reason for that. I barely even used the new and improved VATS in this game because the gunplay was good enough to where I didn't feel like abusing it as much like I did in the previous 2 games. You can read between the lines and kind of excuse the new perk/special system if you think hard enough, but I challenge anyone to argue that this simplified dialogue system is in any way an improvement over the previous games. I touched on this earlier, but I need to explain just how bad this is. So not only do they not even let you see the entire dialogue option before you choose it, but they all pretty much leave you with the same result. They've even added the ability to quick save during dialogue, which makes cheesing these borderline inconsequential speech checks even more trivial. New Vegas is truly the only game here that got this perfectly right in my opinion. I love how the classics do it, but you could argue that it was a little archaic, not actually showing you which dialogue option was the speech check without a perk. But in New Vegas, you either have the skill requirement or you don't. In 3, speech isn't worth putting points into because you can always brute force speech checks. And yeah, I get that you don't have to, and it can be cheap, but the game shouldn't even give you this option. In 4, your speech checks are influenced by your charisma score, and this is even more trivial than before. I found that a lot of the speech checks might as well just be a slight XP boost, and some of them are almost entirely inconsequential. For that reason, it's not worth putting points into charisma. Hell, it's barely worth thinking about where your points go entirely. I mean, yeah, there are some good perks here, but it no longer feels like the way you build your character actually affects your game experience that much, at least when compared to older games. And it definitely doesn't feel like your dialogue options actually affect the game in the same way it did previously. I also have a big problem with the removal of reputation. It seems like such a drastic improvement from 1 to 2, and it also feels like a drastic improvement from 3 to New Vegas. I think I know why they removed this system though. In order to have an effective reputation system in your game, you have to be okay with locking the player out of certain content. If a faction is permanently hostile to you, then you won't be able to do their ending, and Fallout 4 doesn't really lock you out of certain endings until the very end of the game, and it gives you a big pop-up window to let you know exactly what you're doing before you do it. It's not necessarily your choices throughout the course of your playthrough that affects which faction you'll go with, it's whichever one's quest line that you go through first, and you can always stop what you're doing and basically switch teams. Compare this to the classic games where even the wrong dialogue option can lock you out of progressing through certain quests with certain factions. Fallout 4 is a good game, but it can feel like a flanderized iteration of Fallout. An example of this is the excellent Enclave side quest they added in with an update. I call it excellent because of the atmosphere of the glowing sea and the genuine rush I got running into Enclave remnants in the Commonwealth. Going into their base and shooting down a vertibird definitely got my heart racing. It was an excellent moment for an action game, but compare this to the Enclave remnants quest in Fallout New Vegas. Yeah, it's not as immediately exciting, but you get to actually engage in dialogue with the remnants and convince them to do one good thing to redeem themselves from decades and decades of regret. In this quest, you literally just run into hostile Enclave soldiers that you have to kill. It's a combat encounter disguised as a quest. This feels like Borderlands or something, and it's really fun for what it is, but it's not on par with the rest of the series, not even close. I mean, even 3 had the decency to let you talk to some members of the Enclave before you were ultimately meant to blow them up with your fancy new guns. But I'm not gonna lie, despite my criticisms, I really enjoyed this quest. I think I can definitely be a sucker for fan service like this. Side note, I did this quest way too early and ended up with some of the best power armor in the game and an incredibly overpowered Tesla cannon that just uses normal fusion cells. So if a large portion of my footage is just me annihilating stuff with this thing, that's why. I've been generous with Fallout 4 in terms of gameplay and even story, but it's worth mentioning that despite the game having more choices than 3 main story-wise, the ending cinematic pretty much plays out the same way every time, only changing depending on whether you side with the Institute or not. It's really disappointing considering how iconic the changing ending slides are in every previous entry. I mean, the game really just kind of ends. And though you can keep playing and feel some of the effects of your choices naturally throughout the world, this has nothing on the ending slides of previous games, and provides a little bit of an anticlimactic ending. Fallout 4 is a weird one. I've praised it and criticized it pretty equally because despite my overwhelming issues with it, I always end up enjoying my time with it. I don't feel quite as frustrated with this game as I do 3, and I think that's because despite it having a lot of the same problems and being even worse in terms of character creation and dialogue, it's a lot more confidently designed than 3. Its new gameplay mechanics, graphical overhaul, settlement building, and tightly designed world add up to a game that, despite not being a good Fallout game, creates a fun FPS RPG experience. It just doesn't feel like it's trying too hard and failing to be a Fallout game like 3 is. It's just not even trying to be a Fallout game. If I wanted to, I could tear this game to shreds. There's just as many essential NPCs as 3. Dialogue literally means nothing 90% of the time. You can quick save your speech checks and always succeed. The perk tree is an objective downgrade to every preceding entry, but Fallout 4 is still just fun. That being said, I rarely come back to 4. It's nice to play through again every once in a while, but it's not even close to perfect or anything. The truth is, most of the things that keep me coming back to the non-Bethesda Fallout games just aren't here in 4, and for that reason it doesn't get a lot of my attention. I think I've beaten this game 3 times in the last 9 years since release, and comparing that to the amount of times I've come back to other titles in the series isn't favorable. Overall, Fallout 4 is good, sometimes even great, but it's really for fans of games like Prey, Bioshock, or Borderlands. It's not for fans of classic Fallout. To be honest, I expect much of the same from Fallout 76. I'm fortunate to have not experienced this game during its launch or early months. I know all about the shitstorm, which is why I avoided it, but I didn't think it would take me this long to even give it a shot. Apparently it's been polished around the edges and periodically updated. At launch, this game didn't even have NPCs, and it took a long time for them to add them in. That's already a huge red flag for me. Imagine a Fallout game being released without dialogue at all. Well, for months, that was Fallout 76. But I've never played Fallout 76 until now, so I'll be reviewing the game in its current state. Before I get into this, I want to clarify that this is going to be a pretty brief look into this game because 1, this is an MMO and it's going to be a constant grind. It doesn't really have a conclusive ending like the other games. And 2, I've been working on this video for months and it has to end at some point. If you somehow didn't know, Fallout 76 was released in a near broken state. It was buggy and glitchy on nearly every platform. Adding to this, the game was almost entirely barren, with Todd Howard specifically really hell-bent on the idea of having 0 NPCs in the game. This wasn't fixed until almost 2 years after launch with a huge update that was received favorably. Now that the game has been updated several times and is filled with content, how does it stack up to the others in the series? Well, I tried to figure that out and the game crashed on me. This might be a good time to discuss the series' reputation for being a little unpolished. In my personal experience getting footage for this video, I experienced only a couple of crashes and most of the games ran pretty stable. In the case of 3 in New Vegas, I usually always install mods that include bug fixes and things that help with keeping them stable. So that being said, it's hard to judge exactly what playing those games out of the box on PC is like. I'll say that personally, I've played 3 in New Vegas very recently on Xbox One and experienced only very minor bugs and a couple of crashes. So it seems to run fine on that platform. I've also played both on PS3 in the past, and I'd say to avoid those versions if possible. Ironically, the games that gave me the most issues with crashing were the first 2 Fallout games, which might come as a surprise. To be honest though, it's hard not to expect that given that these games were never meant to be run on modern gaming PCs. The fan patches and work that the community has done on the modern ports of these 2 games should be commended, but it's not going to be 100% perfect. Overall though, I very rarely ran into any bugs that severely affected my gameplay experience. This is with all games in their current, most updated states, with 4 and 76 being played totally vanilla. 4 was surprisingly stable, but 76 definitely had some weird stuff going on. NPCs had a tendency to bug out, there was this moment where the ground's collision just broke for no reason, and a lot of times where scripting broke entirely, or I got caught on some shoddy world collision. You can tell that the creation engine was never meant to go online, and if this is the state that 76 is in after 6 years on the market, I can only imagine what it was like playing this game for the first year or so. I'm not trying to be unfair to 76 or something, but I was told that this game was in a relatively stable state these days, and it's nothing I can't overlook for the most part, but I still wouldn't consider this stable in 2024. Come on guys, we should expect better. That being said, 76 is definitely the best looking game in the series. It actually surprised me graphically. Yeah, there are some things that are still stuck in damn near Oblivion territory, like human models, but the lighting and world are really nice in this game. Speaking of the world, West Virginia is pretty cool to explore. Unlike in 4, where it feels like they put this sort of artificial brightness and clean presentation into the game, 76 just genuinely feels like being in an area of the US that wasn't hit nearly as hard as others. I could get super pedantic here and try to argue that the world shouldn't look this good and lush and pretty, but it's hard to care when the game genuinely just looks nice. I did definitely encounter some performance issues, but I will admit that my GTX 970 is barely cutting it these days. So I'm sure with a more reasonable modern rig, you wouldn't have as many issues here. Still, it doesn't look that much better or different than Fallout 4, and that game ran pretty damn good on my PC, so your mileage may vary. In terms of the actual gameplay, I have to admit something here. I've never really been much of an MMO guy. Now, I know that this game isn't even close to replicating the classic MMOs like RuneScape, WoW, or I don't know, MMOs, Wizard 101, but that's okay because it's not really trying to. What I will say is that because there's easily hundreds of hours of content here, and theoretically the game has no real conclusive end, I can't in good conscience sit here and pretend that I've experienced enough of this game to criticize it fairly. That being said, based on my first 10 hours or so, I will say that quests seem to be your standard Bethesda Fallout fare here. Not bad if you liked 4, but not great for immersing you into a story. However, I did some quests for the Brotherhood here, and I'd argue that this was a lot more boring than Fallout 4's Brotherhood quests. I'm just barely scratching the surface here, and I'm not a big fan of Bethesda's Brotherhood in the first place. So it's one of those things that I have to admit I wasn't going to enjoy very much before I even got started. I feel like because of the MMO design here, the game has to omit features standard to the series, like quick saving and pausing the game, and because of this, Fallout 76 is more afraid to give the player any real sense of choice than ever. Almost every single quest-giving NPC I encountered was essential and unkillable. This was already a worrying trend starting with Fallout 3, and I'm not surprised to see it continued here, but this is the worst it's ever been. These are basically fetch quests. Hell, they're even worse than that. These feel like Far Cry side quests or something. It's a pretty hollow experience, and one that I have to admit I'm slightly disappointed in. This being said, I'm absolutely playing this game not in the way it's truly intended. Yes, they added NPCs and quests and loads of content and areas later on, but this game was designed from the ground up to not really have any of that stuff. Because of this, the quests I played at least felt like a little bit of an afterthought. The looting and combat mechanics of 4 work really nicely for this kind of grindy FPS MMO thing they're going for, and I can see that truly being a blast if you play with the right people. For the purposes of this video, and because none of my friends actually play this game, I did most of my playing solo, which I think actually hurt my experience. I imagine getting a party together and hitting daily events and big later Brotherhood quests is really fun, actually. To add to that, the community of this game seems to be actually really helpful and welcoming to new players. Nothing can ruin getting into a big online game a little later, quite like losers who make the experience dreadful for everyone else. And I'm happy to say that that was not my experience at all. I can imagine having a lot of fun with this game under the right context, and I certainly will be coming back to it after working on this video. That being said, I have to judge this game on the same merits of the other titles. And for what I expect out of a Fallout title, it didn't really deliver for me. Now, I know my expectations are pretty high, but I would have pretty much been okay with online Fallout 4. And though the game delivers on that with some aspects, I think the quests have been even more dumbed down. I mean, it's even hard to make certain groups of raiders hostile to you. These are completely straight-line linear quests. Yeah, skill checks and speech are back, and it's not just tied to your charisma like 4, and I really like that. But it still doesn't save conversation from feeling pretty inconsequential. I don't know, guys. I expected to really either enjoy this game with all the new content or to outright hate it, and I'm not feeling either right now. I feel like with some time and the right people, I could put many hours into this game. But as a game in the Fallout series, this has got to be the least drawn into the story or the world I've ever been. I didn't spend a lot of time with it, maybe 8 to 10 hours, so it's possible my perspective shifts entirely over time. But for right now, it's difficult for me to recommend 76 unless you really love Fallout and are looking for a way to play some quests with your friends. Well, this video took a lot longer than I thought it would. Though there have been a lot of ups and downs looking at the series, I'm happy to say that when it comes to the mainline titles, I don't despise or even really actively dislike any of them. I know I got pretty nitpicky in this video with some of the games, but that's what makes the series special to me. The games that nail it for me really nail it for me, providing excellent story beats, player choice, varied arsenals, great presentation, good atmosphere, and true freedom within an RPG. The games that I had my fair share of problems with, that I liked a little bit less, were still overall worthwhile experiences, with 3 especially being a problematic favorite of mine that I enjoy coming back to. And then there's Fallout 4, which was a really good time despite definitely failing to provide what I generally look for in these games. This being said, I did promise a ranking at the end of my video, and I will deliver on that. It should come as no surprise that New Vegas is my #1 pick. As much as I want to be different from the pack here, I can't even pretend that it's not the definitive best game in the series. Next up is Fallout 1. It might surprise some to see it beating out 2 and 3, but Fallout 1 is my favorite Fallout game to beat quickly in an afternoon. They nailed just about every aspect here, and I think it's a damn near perfect RPG. Next is Fallout 2. Despite my problems with the game's decision to get darker and sillier at the same time, tonally, Fallout 2 is still one of the best games in the series from a quest design and dialogue perspective. It's Fallout 1, but slightly more flawed and significantly bigger. Alright, now for the controversial picks. Fallout 4 is next on my list. I feel like I've pissed off maybe 80% of Fallout fans by putting this game above 3, but I just can't help it. 3 actively frustrates me a lot more than this game. Fallout 4, as I mentioned earlier, gives me basically nothing that I look for in a Fallout game, but standing on its own, it's just a lot more fun and fleshed out than Fallout 3. Speaking of Fallout 3, it's up next. My biggest problem with this game is the way that it so effortlessly replicates the feel of the first 2 games in a 3D space through its presentation and atmosphere, but fails to deliver on translating that true RPG sense of freedom the first 2 games represented. This is easily the weakest main story in a single-player Fallout game, and it's the main reason that when I come back to this game, I just wander the wastes, creating my own fun. It's still a really fun game, and I really enjoy playing it when I do that, but compared to other games in the series, that main quest is just a slog. I honestly don't know if I had any fun at all doing it again for this video. That leaves the obvious pick of Fallout 76 as my least favorite. Like I mentioned earlier, I think it's possible that I haven't spent enough time with 76 yet to fully criticize it fairly, so take some comfort in that if it's your favorite game in the series or the only one you've ever played. I still had a decent bit of fun here and didn't hate it. I just think that it didn't really deliver on the sheer spectacle of 4 or the more open RPG approach of earlier titles. It's its own beast and it just hasn't clicked for me, and I'm not entirely sure if it will yet. Okay, well that does it. I'm done talking about Fallout for now. I'm definitely not opposed to making more videos on the series if this one does alright, but I might take just a second and work on other projects in the interim. Thank you so much for watching and making it to the end of the video. Please like the video and subscribe if you liked what you saw. I have a Patreon link in the description if you want to help the channel more directly. Otherwise, I hope everyone watching has a great day.